So, welcome to Anthroposophical. Anthroposophical is dedicated to anthroposophy, and if you are new here, then welcome. Nice to have you here. Um, if you would like to support the work here, I have another channel off of here, Patreon, which I'll put the link in below. Subscription is like is $10 a month, which is like the price of a pizza or less, depending where you are. You can follow then the work on there too, because anthroposophy is not an easy subject. It's a difficult subject, and it's meant to be so that we engage our thinking to transform ourselves through an activation of our thinking to appreciate and develop our consciousness to make a step into the spiritual world. And that's the source and the aim of much of what we are talking about with anthroposophy. And so many of the concepts and subjects we'll be looking into today, and that we've looked at in many of the other videos, are going deeper into this subject of anthroposophy and of the makeup of the spiritual world. And so some of these things might be a bit complicated. So if you are new to anthroposophy or you are new to this channel, bear in mind that this is padded, this is backed up by many other videos and texts, like I said, that I've published on Patreon and in the Facebook groups. And it should be remembered that much of this work is based on the extensive work of Rudolf Steiner in the basic, about 30 basic books, which I kind of assume that people know or will come to know through the inspiration of the things that we speak about, or that they already know. And that's without mentioning the over 3,000 lectures and material that can be found in those lectures from Rudolf Steiner himself. And all that can be found on the RS archive, and a lot of the work of Rudolf Steiner can be found online. And so without further ado, let's get into the subject that we're going to look at today, which is the subject of Pandora, Pandora's box, and the subject of Vulcan. And I'm bringing this subject today because I was writing recently about this, and for some reason this subject got flagged up on community standards, which the mind boggles, like, for why. But I think maybe because the text might have been too long for social media. So increasingly, I'm looking for ways to bring some of this material across, and I can do some of it, I guess, here on YouTube, and some of it then on Patreon, according to, you know, how these different algorithms are designed. Anyway, you might be wondering, what is this beautiful stone behind me? This is a tourmaline, which is often referenced in anthroposophy because of the incredible geometric forms that can be found and seen, and the colors that can be seen in the tourmaline. And this is also something that I've written recently, which again will be on Patreon, which is about the relation of the colors to spiritual sight into the different time epochs, and how consciousness develops and comes to see, the human being comes to see have different experiences, moral, inner, spiritual experiences of color through the different time epochs. For example, we see behind me the magenta relating to the experience of the human being in the ancient Indian epoch. And then we have the indigo in between the blue here and the indigo, creating a kind of violet. Now the violet in between, on that border between magenta and green, blue, indigo, is something we have to concentrate on. And I think this is a good picture for the study of anthroposophy at all, because on the one hand, we're dealing with content and the understanding, the development of our consciousness in understanding anthroposophical concepts. On the other hand, we have to have the meditation that takes place in parallel, accompanying that study of anthroposophy, so that the two fructify each other. And very much this is the challenge that takes us all the way through from the ancient Indian epoch, through Persia, through Egypt to Greece, and then into what's called the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, where we have this challenge of indigo. And the challenge of indigo is for us to develop consciousness without falling into black. And this is something that in the article I've explained much more deeply, but I'm just giving that as a background to why I have this stone behind me. And it's a very lovely stone. Anyway, without further ado, Steiner once said that one of the tasks of the West in terms of mechanical occultism is that the mechanical would flow into the moral, and the moral would flow into the mechanical, and that this flowing of the one into the other is part of the challenge of technology and mechanical occultism that he ascribes to the West. And it is something that we are being called to understand more and more, especially with these devices themselves. And the question of devices and computers and smartphones, however you're listening and watching this media, is a question that we are confronted with exactly in this form and format, in that I am speaking to you and speaking to you of spiritual matters, of the moral, and the very deed of speaking to you in this medium is flowing through something mechanical. And it takes us right back to this understanding of technology as techna. And from an anthroposophical perspective, the concepts of anthroposophy themselves are a kind of techna, a kind of technology. And I hope to better explain this as we go along. And already you might be saying, God, this sounds very, very complicated. But that's, again, something that I was emphasizing at the beginning, that it's important that it is complicated. And this is something not me wanting to make it extra complicated. No, this is something that I'm stressing and Rudolf Steiner stressed, which is it needs to be complicated, that the listener, that the audience, that the consumer of such knowledge precisely should not be just a consumer, but they should have to bring all of their education, all of their experience of the arts, of education, of culture, to their understanding of the conceptual work and the understanding of anthroposophy as it is presented, precisely because by doing that, the whole human being is activated to need to use their mind to make these things conscious. And you see that this effort that goes in through concentration and striving to understand what is being said is part of the process that we need to go through, and it changes us in a way very different from the passive kind of listening and consuming of knowledge that we are kind of brought up to to be used to, whether it's in school or in training, in work, either to just learn things by rote, to memorize things, or to accept things on authority, or to take technology as something that just allows us to switch off the mind. And it was, for me, it was very interesting recently being on holiday and having to use having to write things down because I didn't have roaming on my phone, so I had to write things down and had quite a lot of stress in doing this, a lot of arguments to get to certain places, precise, but through doing this you see it's something very different than just following the GPS. And so part of these questions are again moral questions about how we engage and how we use technology, and making conscious of the moral choices that when we choose to not memorize a place name or a number or name, and we're using the device, it's an example to help us think about how active we are in our daily lives, in our minds, in our thinking. And this is perhaps a good way to understand that first quote from Steiner, that we can carry through everything that we'll say today about how the mechanical flows into the moral. And especially when we're going to look today at Pandora's box, originally this is kind of a mistranslation, because what is noted in Wikipedia, for example, is that this is a mistranslation of Pandora's jar. But whether it's jar or box, or as we shall see, relating to an oyster in the paintings. So maybe I should just take a step back. We're going to look at a number of paintings today from art history in relation to this. And so we'll be going for about an hour or so anyway. Yeah, getting back to Pandora, perhaps that's a good place to start. Let's have a look at, we're looking at Pandora and Vulcan from Greek mythology as representative of, in some ways, the first man and woman. Now, how can we say this? A lot of what we're doing in anthroposophy is looking at things that have come to us through myth, pre-Golgotha, pre-Christ, in pagan times, that they contained in their cultures that through anthroposophy we can come to bring to full consciousness and understand what they were talking about. And one of these windows into a truth of reality is this understanding of Pandora and Vulcan. Now, I just want to find it here. And here I will show you. So, I think this is particularly lovely. This is here we have. This is Vulcan presents Pandora to the gods from Johann Weiss, 1640 to 1704. And this is like a good first introduction to the theme. So Pandora is often spoken as the first earthly woman. And then when we talk about Pandora's box and all of the challenges that comes from opening the box, what we're called to do here is hold this as an imagination of what does it mean. We could think of the story of Eden, when man and woman are driven out of paradise, out of the Garden of Eden. What is this picture for humanity as a whole, losing consciousness of the gods? And when we look at Vulcan, also in mythology, it's spoken of how he is lamed in one leg. And you can see almost part of this understanding here in how he's standing. And he's presenting here Pandora to the gods. And there's another reference in another place from Hesiod, I think a Greek poet, where it speaks of how the gods retreat to Olympus and all that's left is hope. Now, I find this very, very interesting because from an anthroposophical perspective, what we're looking at with the development of technology and the other great distinction of Vulcan being the use of fire, and then the background to the whole mythology with Prometheus stealing the fire of the gods. Anthroposophically, we're looking at something very, very deep, because the fire initiation that Christ brings. So if we remember back in our Bible, we have the baptism of John is a baptism of water. And he speaks of how he must decrease so that he that comes after shall increase. We have reference here to a water initiation and then the initiation of fire. Now, what does fire mean? We have an understanding of this in the figure of Vulcan, because through fire, things may be created. And to do this, we are working down into matter. And when we work down into matter, into the metals, into the earth, the whole question of the underworld and the inner earth is something that is called to our minds. Now, it's something we're going to that's going to accompany us through this exploration of these different themes today. But let's come back to Pandora's box. Now, there's another one here. So excuse me while I just call up another picture here. Again, this is another very lovely one. I've focused in here on part of Jan Bruegel the Younger's painting of Vulcan, Venus visiting Vulcan in his forge. So again, you can go and look up the mythology of Vulcan, and there you'll see that he, in fact, marries Venus at one point. And here he doesn't look so bad, but it's described how strange this is, because he's quite ugly, but his devices are able to win him the most beautiful of brides in Venus. And I think this is a very interesting excerpt from the main painting. Firstly, because you can see right in the distance, almost as if we have traversed from Maya, from the outer world of Maya, down into the inner earth. So very much we are in an enclosed, okay, we can say this is like a cathedral or a church, but in a way it's like a tunnel going down, as if we're going down, seeing the world we're used to seeing, the outer world, out there beyond the tunnel. And then as if we're right down in the inner earth here, with this seated figure of Vulcan. And then I'm not sure if this is Cupid, but this, like a son of Venus, presenting something like an oyster shell to Vulcan. Or we could say, is this something like Pandora's box that Cupid is showing to Vulcan? And we don't see what's in this. Is there a pearl in this? If it was a pearl, this would also suggest the deepest point of the inner earth, the 9th layer of the inner earth, through which we would have to descend in initiation to come to the Father, through the 9th to the 10th, to the center, to that center point, an omega point that we would come through. And this is something that is referred to in many of the alchemical references to the pearl. And if we think of how the pearl is created through this long pressure within the living body of the oyster on this grain, to through continual pressure to work this up to this very hard pearl-like substance. And it's quite the question of the 9th layer of the inner earth is again a theme that I'm only mentioning here, which would need further exposition. And again, like I said, this is part of the background of deeper studies of anthroposophy. But it's interesting that he's being presented this here. And then the other thing that's interesting, I think, is to look at the gazes. There's very interesting gazes here. Remember that Vulcan is responsible for work with weapons. We see this very well presented here. Armory, which again is very well presented. And we see also the horse in the background. with almost two wooden legs, and then the horse's body, and then the armory of the knight seated on the horse, and then the cannon behind. So we have all of these workings of metal into weapons of war. And this whole theme of war and conflict will again come through in the mythology when Venus has an affair with Mars, which we'll look at in the next painting. But just here, I just want us to get to a sense of how metal is worked, and also to remember that with all this working of the hands of the fire in Vulcan's forge, we are also called to look at the work of our eyes. Now, what do I mean by the work of our eyes? A bit like what we did at the beginning with the tourmaline, we're looking at how the eye has a law of itself, very nicely presented in any painterly work, of how there are laws of color and composition that are not intellectual or abstract in any way, but they are living laws of harmony. Now, all of this is very, very important in understanding the relationship between the mechanical and the moral, because right in the middle of the mechanical and the moral, unless we are to become automatons functioning only mechanically, we have to ask, what is it that allows what we produce mechanically to, in a sense, become part of our world? It has to be of use to the human being. And then we can say, okay, that's an interesting thing to reflect on. What is it that allows us, what is it that the smartphone, the computer, the technology, the car, the machines that we have around us, how is this changing our relationship to the world around us? And this could be a very deep reaching question if we think of the whole development of industrialization and the development of humanity through early modern Europe in the last hundreds of years, through industrialization up to the 19th century and 20th century. And to look at how this descent, we speak in anthroposophy of a descent into materialism, how this has changed the human being's understanding of the world around them and how they are related to it. And all this, I think we can follow simply in a very artistic way through the gazes. Cupid looking to Vulcan, the knight not looking anywhere, looking into his helmet, and stiff. Very interesting. Stiff. And then Venus looking somewhat generously, let's say, at Vulcan's face, and Vulcan kind of pained. Looking, where is Vulcan looking? Is he looking outward? I think you'd agree if you look at the furrow of his brow and his eyes, it's almost like an introspective looking, as if he's looking out from his body out backwards. And this would be helpful because this backward view from the back out to the gate to Maya and to the natural world beyond this gate is an interesting reflection back to what I said about the inner earth. And this is kind of Vulcan's lot in life, to be cast out as all of humanity is, cast out from paradise to walk this path of the sons of Cain through the inner earth, and to be tasked with developing science and technology. But there's almost this melancholy look of Vulcan, because this estrangement from the spiritual, we could say then something about the relationship Cain and Abel. But this estrangement, is this the estrangement from Abel? We could even surmise a kind of relationship here between Vulcan and the man seated on as the knight, to kind of echo some of this relationship of Cain and Abel. Anyway, let's leave that for now and look at the bigger painting from which this is taken, and I think we'll be able to see some other interesting relationships here. So here we have Jan Bruegel the Younger in big format, of how it should be seen in its full context. And it takes a while just to take all of this in. A lot of this Flemish Dutch painting, the canvas is filled with different characters, and there's so much detail to see of all the things that are going on. And again, like we looked at with Bosch, this is very much the experience of Holland's great empire, and bringing all these wealth of things from Asia. But let's look again at, because I think it's a very interesting reflection on the world of products that can kind of come to suffocate us. And this is a problem, as we can see here. It's not a completely new problem, because we can see the cluttered nature of all of these devices that Vulcan has created in his forge, almost as if they've come to plague him. And then all of the social relationships that have grown out of this. So, and perhaps this is where Venus stands there, accompanying him, Venus as Vulcan's wife, accompanying him in this kind of desolation of products of war, and all of the finery that is draped over the tables, all of the jewelry, the armor, the quite spectacular gold cannons. Yeah, and then we get a very clear understanding that these arched vaults are kind of in the inner earth, because we see that they are forming these domes underneath the hill, underneath the vegetation, as we can see up on the left. Yeah. So we're going to move on, and the next one we're going to look at is this theme of Venus is, in mythology, Venus is married to Vulcan. And there's a complex story of how they come to be married that actually through the cleverness of Vulcan, he comes to somehow engineer also his way to get this most beautiful of prizes in Venus. But it's described as a loveless and childless marriage. And then that due to this, Venus is always pining for extramarital lovers, and she finds this in Mars. Now, this is very, very interesting because we see that Vulcan himself has been busy the whole time developing devices, and his work in the forge has been making the weapons of war. And so it's then a strange kind of ironic karma that Venus then ends up going astray with Mars, the god of war. And this is where we see a very different depiction. This is from Velasquez. And this is the moment when, hold on a minute. This is the moment when Apollo appears, Apollo the sun god, appears in the forge and tells Vulcan that of his wife Venus's infidelity with Mars. And it's quite nice here to see how the faces of the workers of Vulcan are startled, shocked at what Apollo is telling them. How can this be? While they're so busy working down in the forge. But it's his devices that bind her. He is ugly, she is beautiful. This, I think what's fascinating here, and come to another one here, where we see it better. Here's very beautiful Venus and Cupid. Cupid not so beautiful here. Venus then showing, Cupid showing, taking something from Vulcan, and Vulcan quite brute here and almost blind. The workers almost caveman-like, and Venus here very, very lithe, very beautiful, very flowing. The whole etheric flowing of her cape here, very finely held in its form with her figure and her step. And then in the background, we have this cerulean blue, and we have the two doves meeting above. That somehow we are asked, how does this marriage in humanity take place between Vulcan and Venus? And this question of Venus in relation to the arts is something that we can carry in relation to technology. We can see this with all of our devices now, and what will come in the next years is how AI is going to take over all of social media, and we won't really know the difference anymore between what is an AI person and what is a real person. And all of these questions are going to be brought right into our lives from this technology we have all around us. And the question is going to be, however beautiful the media is that we have around us, and there's a question whether it is beautiful, or the question of film and cinema and music and the whole question of high art and low art. But there's a deeper question, and that's the question of the social art and the question of karma and what links us as humanity to each other. And this is what we call in anthroposophy and in the occult the royal art. And it's a royal art because at the top, traditionally, we had the king and the queen, much like we have the bees in nature, a hive, and then the devotion to the queen of the hive. These are all occult images of how we govern, what is governance of society, and how we are linked to each other in karma. So this question of karma and reincarnation and how people are here in incarnated life to pay off their karma, to understand their karma, and to, through karma, to re-find their connection to the gods, is an underlying theme that is represented also by Venus. So this marriage of Venus and Vulcan in Greek mythology is actually holding for us in imagination secrets of the spiritual and the earthly and how they are interrelated, waiting for a time when we can bring these to consciousness. And in terms of that consciousness, it's very interesting to see the doves here, because we know how in Christianity it is the dove that comes down at the baptism of Christ by John in the Jordan. And if people know the painting well, Piero della Francesca, with the image of the dove coming into the body of Christ, there's a kind of reference to that here with the two doves. And in a very broad sense, it's how can we come to, rather than kill or reject the other as Cain does with Abel, how can we come to unite with the other, as we see with this harmony between the two doves? There's something very interesting here. It's almost like a third eye in the forehead of this, like reference to a kind of atavistic clairvoyance of pagan times in this caveman. And again, this would be a reference to how can the human being develop a new clairvoyance of the spiritual. And that is part of what we are looking to do with the development of consciousness with the study of anthroposophy. Now, one of the when we're talking about clairvoyance and initiation, one of the experiences of this growing consciousness, this growing understanding of the spiritual in our lives, is something that sounds quite simple. And it's deceptively so, because it's one of the deepest experiences of the spiritual life, and something that permeates all the way through, right from the beginnings of initiation right up to through, and when one is quite far in initiation, over the threshold of the spiritual world, it is always something that is that needs to be always maintained and developed ever more clearly. And that is the distinction that we make in anthroposophy between thinking, feeling, and willing. this threefold distinction, which we can take right up to an understanding of the Holy Spirit, Christ the Son, and the Father, this threefold distinction of thinking, feeling, and willing is something that I'd like to make reference back to why anthroposophy needs this penetration, this deeper engagement with the things that we study, whether they're from art history or from the occult or from a philosophical understanding or from the meditation on ourselves. Because through self-knowledge, it is this understanding of our own thinking, feeling, and willing that through self-knowledge we can come to see and get an idea of where are we still chaotic in our thinking, feeling, and willing, and where can we bring order. And if we see one of the effects of initiation is that we start to understand how we're connected to humanity as a whole. So what one part of humanity experiences comes to be felt as part of our own lives and our own experience. And so that this border is no longer there as soon as we purify ourselves from the more subjective, egoistic view of ourselves and life. We start to have this experience of being part collective, of the collective of humanity. And part of this is firstly understanding that we are working to develop our thinking, and through our thinking develop new consciousness. And secondly, we're moving beyond like the sympathies and antipathies, the likes and dislikes of this or that aspect of ourselves or of life, and we're developing a kind of neutrality. And this neutrality is important because it's this higher feeling that enables us to bring our thinking to new aspects of knowledge. And these new aspects of knowledge are some of the things that I've been presenting today in relation to how we look at a painting, how we look at what is depicted to us in painting and through mythology. And very much, again, like we said before, the Greek myths and the things that we've inherited are things that we can come to newly understand through anthroposophy. So bringing this all to a head, so to speak, I'd like to look finally at a painting of Pandora's called Pandora's Box by Magritte from 1951. Because again, this theme of humanity, the human being somehow cast out from the spiritual world, and the difficult experience of having opened something, having left that spiritual world, the challenge to find one's way back, and the fact that it's male and female that is emphasized all the time here. Pandora and Vulcan, or Vulcan and Venus, and the interplay between male and female is very much how we engage our creativity. And so this question of ourselves and the other, whether that's another of the opposite sex or an other as humanity, as our relationship to the whole of humanity, I want to just look at this in relation to Magritte, because we see many of these subjects becoming more pertinent to us when we start to feel history and its effect on us. So I think many would agree here that the experiences after 2020 and the experience now is a certain kind of craziness in the air. And there would be good reason for this, because we are in apocalyptic times now. And in anthroposophy, we speak of mankind taking a step over the threshold in the mid 19th century. And interestingly enough, this is 165 years before now, with 1848, time of the publishing of the Communist Manifesto. And this is a full cycle of Neptune. So Neptune goes round the zodiac. And there's something nice that Leo King said recently about how Aleister Crowley wrote about Neptune in Aquarius, and how this experience of Neptune, from Neptune being able to look at the fortress of the sun. Without going further into this, it's an interesting experience of how through this experience of Neptune at the end of Pisces now, so at the end of the zodiac circle, preparing next year to take its step down into Aries, we're at the end of a huge cycle. And I think many of us can feel this somewhat in the air, this feeling of being on the brink of something new. And this being in these far reaches of the cosmos through this experience of Neptune, which is right far out beyond Saturn. This is something that we are kind of picking up on, and it's a reference back to the middle of the 19th century when mankind first crossed the threshold to the spiritual world. And interestingly enough, there is a reference also back to 45 AD when Paul first begins his journeys. And this would also relate back to the experience as Paul as the first to experience the return of Christ in the etheric. And this is again something that many more are able to experience in humanity now, the return of Christ in the etheric. Should we go through this process of developing our consciousness, which is what I've been trying to outline here, that this, through doing this, we can come to have this experience of Christ, and how through this experience of Christ, our spiritual understanding, our spiritual sight opens up as to how the spiritual and the earthly worlds are interrelated. Anyway, without further ado, the subject of the Paul and the great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, relating back to 2020, is something that I'll do another video on at some point. I've written quite extensively about this. Again, you can have a look on Patreon for this. But without further ado, this is Magritte's painting. And I think it's very interesting here how we are kind of blocked off. And again, we're not shown, a bit like Cupid with Vulcan, we're not shown what we would see of the face of the man on the other side. And then to call this painting Pandora's box, I think it's a very interesting meditation, also in terms of the cardamom red of the sky. And the relation between that red, the magenta on the roofs, and then the rose here, it's kind of quite irksome, quite disturbing, flatness, almost frozenness of the figure, this theme of freezing, stagnation, and almost like a 2D cutout effect of the figure, and yet whole world, and the very strong juxtaposition of these reds and magentas and the building, and almost like a bridge here. And if we make reference to the Second World War and everything Magritte would have just seen in terms of the ends to which mankind puts its devices, it's of, again, quite a melancholic mood to look at what we are being called to think on here in relation to humanity as a whole. Anyway, I'll write up the names of the paintings and I'll put the links in the commentary below. Subscribe if you haven't already, really helps the channel. And thanks for watching, and I shall, any questions, put them in the comments. That's great, and I shall follow up perhaps on some of these things. And that's it for now. All the best. Ciao, ciao.